last lesson, we saw that thousands and thousands of Puritans left their homes in England and settled in New England, especially during the so-called Great Migration. Now, when these Puritans from South England largely came to the New World, they brought with them their beliefs, their attitudes, their way of looking at the world, their prejudices, and they brought those ideas with them from England to New England. But in the course of the 17th and 18th century, as they adapted to a very alien and different environment, there slowly evolved over time a very new and unique society in New England, with its own economic, social, and political institutions and practices, which were very, very different than their homeland of England. Now, this began by looking at the New England economy that developed. Now, New England, just like England, was what we call a pre-industrial society. That meant that about 90% of the population devoted their lives to raising crops and being farmers. Now, the situation in New England was quite different than it would have been in England, because in New England there was a large amount of land available. So it was more common for people to own their own piece of property, to own their own farmland, than it had ever been in England. In fact, it's estimated that about 2/3 of all adult males own their own land in New England. You know, contrast that with England, where it may be less than 10% owned their own land. Now, in New England, you had a situation where most people lived on family farms. Large estates worked by tenant farmers or indentured servants or slaves were rare in New England, with perhaps the exception of Rhode Island. But in most places in New England, most farms were pretty small and run by and organized and operated by families. Now, by family farm, what I mean is that in these family farms, the plowing, the harvesting was largely done by members of the family, mothers, fathers, children. And in New England, they practiced largely subsistence agriculture. Most farms raised just enough grain and livestock to support their own family. If there was anything left over, if there was any crops that they didn't need to feed themselves, that would be brought to market, to the local town, the same place where they went to church, and there they could purchase manufactured goods. Things like tools and glassware and pottery. You see, it's important to remember that the Puritans were Englishmen, and they didn't want to live like Native Americans. They wanted to live like Englishmen, and that meant you needed English goods and English manufactured goods to live like a true Englishman. So now, the problem that New England faced was that they did not have the labor to manufacture goods. Most everybody who could afford to, and most everybody owned land. So there wasn't a large landless population that could be hired to work in manufacturing, to work in workshops. So since they didn't have access to their own manufactured goods, New England merchants, the New England colonists as merchants, had to go out and find these manufactured goods and go to England to get them. So in order to do this, in order to ensure enough manufactured goods from England, what developed in the course of the 17th century was a trading network that is called the triangle trade. Now this triangle trade that developed in the 17th century is called the triangle trade because it involved 3 different continents across the Atlantic. You had England and Europe, you had North America, like the Caribbean and the American colonies, and then you had West Africa. Now, in the case of New England, the way it worked would be that in New England they had grain and they had timber for building ships and so forth. And what they would do is that New England merchants would bring these products, the grain and the wood products, down to the Caribbean or to the southern colonies. In the Caribbean, in the West Indies, for example, they raised sugar. From sugar you can make rum, which was a very popular drink. They could go and get tobacco from the Caribbean, or get tobacco from the southern colonies, or rice, which was another cash crop. So They would go to the southern colonies or to the Caribbean and get these cash crops, and then they would bring them to England, where these cash crops were in great demand. And when they got to England, they would exchange the cash crops for the manufactured goods. Now, once they had manufactured goods, they could go back and sell these manufactured goods back in the American colonies. But another route they could take was to go to West Africa. Now, in West Africa, there was a demand for English manufactured goods, like especially weapons like guns and iron tools and so forth. And so they would go to West Africa and they would exchange these manufactured goods for slaves from West Africa. Because you've got to remember that the cash crops like tobacco and sugar in the South and in the Caribbean, all the labor to raise those crops was done by slave labor imported from Africa. So even New England, even though New England didn't have its own plantations or didn't have slaves in very large quantities at all, New England merchants especially profited from the slave trade. That's how they made a lot of their money. In fact, by the 18th century, English and New England merchants dominated the slave trade across the Atlantic, bringing thousands of people from Africa to plantations in the Caribbean and South America and in the southern colonies. So that's how the economy worked in the region. Now, when we look at the social situation, what we find is that in New England, the merchants were the ones who made the most money. They were the wealthiest. So even though the vast majority of Englishmen were farmers who lived off the land and had family farms, you had a small elite of merchants who were making pretty good money as they got more involved in the triangle trade. Now, when we talk about society, and when we talk about New England society, it's important to remember that they brought with them their ideas. They brought with them their prejudice and their views from England. Now, the traditional way that they looked at the world was that it was believed that certain people were meant by God to be leaders and others were meant to be followers. Now, in England, the landed aristocracy, or the gentry, they were the leaders. We get the word gentleman from gentry. The English aristocracy, they owned estates. They had titles like Lord and Sir and Duke and Earl and so forth. And they were always seen as the social superiors. And they were viewed as the God-given natural leaders of society. And everybody was expected to treat them as such and refer them as Mr. When we say refer to somebody as Mr. or as Mrs., those are shorthand for Mr. and Mistress. And originally only aristocrats were known as Mr. and Mrs. That was a title that belonged to the elites. Now, in New England, though, they had a very special situation. Not a whole lot of aristocrats left the comforts of England to come to New England. So like John Winthrop and Roger Williams were members of the gentry, but they were the exception. William Bradford was another one. They were gentry, but the vast majority of people who came to the American colonies were commoners. So there was a vacuum at the top. There was not an elite in charge. There was not an elite that could run the country. So whenever you have a vacuum, it gets filled. Now, in the case of New England, the New England merchants were the ones who filled that vacuum. Why? Because they had the resources, they had the wealth to have the attributes and the characteristics of the English aristocracy. I mean, they weren't aristocrats themselves, but they had the money to act like aristocrats. They could build a nice house, and they could have servants, and they could drive a carriage drawn by horses, and they would adopt titles like Esquire, and they could send their kids to college to get an education. So these attributes were only the attributes of the aristocracy, and since the merchants could afford these types of luxury, they became the new colonial aristocracy. So in New England, merchants were the ones that acted as the aristocracy, the elites in New England society. Now, there's a thing you need to remember when you look at merchants is that merchants, it's a lot easier to lose money if you're a merchant than, let's say, if you're a landed aristocrat. In other words, it was possible for a merchant family to hit hard times and to lose their money and lose their wealth. In other words, being a merchant means that you have to have business acumen. You have to have the ability to be a good businessman. So as a result, in New England, over time, there developed this idea that aristocracy wasn't just about inheriting a position, that being an aristocrat, being a natural leader meant that you were someone who, by your achievements and skills and business sense, deserved to be a position of leadership. And also, another thing about the Puritans, since they valued Christian values, being an aristocrat meant that you needed to embrace those values and have a good reputation in the community and be a man of good morals. And that was distinct from what you find from the hereditary aristocracy back in England. Now, another thing that developed over time in New England was the fact that since so many people own land, there was kind of a rough equality among the New Englanders, in the sense that since almost everybody owned their own land and had a family farm, the New England landowners over time kind of assumed a lot of the same attributes as the yeoman farmer. The yeoman farmer was the commoner in England who owned his own land. Now, they were quite rare in England, but in New England, the yeoman farmer who owned his own land was the norm. And so they had this kind of common sense, egalitarian sense of, and they could all vote, and many of them assumed many of the same attributes as the gentry. So they started to refer to each other as Mr. and Mrs., which formerly had only been the attributes of the aristocracy. So there began to develop in New England a rough sense of equality among the colonists. Now, let's look at the political system in New England. Now, when the colonists arrived, you see, to be a free man was someone who was an adult male who owned his own property. And in England, anybody who was a free man who owned his own property had the right to vote. Also in England, if you were a freeman, that you had certain rights as an Englishman. Going back to the Middle Ages, going back to the Magna Carta of 1215, the English kings had granted Englishmen, freemen, certain rights. Like, for example, the right to a trial by jury and the right to own property. And so now, in a situation in England, only a very small percentage of the population, less than 10%, owned land and were thus considered freemen who had those rights and who could vote and could elect people to Parliament. But you switch over to the situation in New England, you had a situation where about 60 to 75% of all adult males own property. And thus, all those people in New England who owned property felt that they enjoyed the rights of Englishmen. And they also had the right to elect representatives to their local legislature. Often in New England it was called the General Court. So even though the people in New England had a lot of the same political views as people in England, the situation in New England allowed much greater political participation. And so political participation was much more common in New England than it had ever been in Old England. Now, another thing that we see is that we can see the influence of the Congregational Church in New England. You see, remember I mentioned that earlier in another lecture, we talked about how at the center of every New England town was the meeting hall where they would meet and for church. But that was also the local town hall. And whenever they had elections or had any issues affecting the community, they would have their New England town hall meeting. And they would meet in the Congregational Church. Now, in the Congregational Church, any member of the church could speak their mind and have a voice. And the same was true of the New England political town meeting. And it would be at these town meetings that they would elect their local legislatures or elect local officers to govern the community. Now, what we see often is that the farmers who dominated these meetings usually showed a lot of deference. And so they usually elected the aristocrats. Usually local merchants were the ones that tended to dominate local elections because they were seen as having the attributes of aristocrats. But another thing that's important to remember is that in every town, the local merchants were the ones who controlled credit. So if a farmer needed to borrow money or borrow something for his farm, he often went to the merchant who had cash to receive loans. So the economic position of the merchants in every local town, the fact that they controlled credit was another reason why they were the ones who made up the local colonial aristocracy that dominated local elections. So we've looked at New England. We've looked at its economic life, its social life, its political life. The next big area that we're going to look at is the middle colonies.